Welcome to A Theory of Everything. Just before the outbreak of the coronavirus, I had the privilege of sitting down to a conversation with Charles Murray, the eminent American political scientist and philosopher. We talked about his latest book, Human Diversity, the biology of gender, race, and class. We also talked about intelligence, leadership, and about the role that government should or shouldn't play in our lives. Topics that are extremely relevant at a time when most of the world is locked down and people are dying because of something that could have been avoided. I hope this surreal turn of events motivates you to take this podcast seriously. What we're about to discuss is important, not only because of the role that Charles Murray has played and continues to play as a leading public policy analyst and political philosopher for the most powerful country in the world, but also because there's a lot at stake. If we don't resolve the core intellectual problem that's festering like a virus in the human brain, what comes next for us as a species is likely to be orders of magnitude worse than a global pandemic. What the first 3 months of 2020 have made abundantly clear is something we've known for a long time. We need a more effective way to respond to problems of a global nature. However, there's also a paradox at play here that most of us are not aware of, and it's troubling. The paradox is this: as the human species forges ahead, the things we think are going to make us happy, things like more freedom, more equality, better education, and less corruption, are actually going to keep dividing and confusing us more and more. The work of Charles Murray is the key to understanding why, so let's talk about it. For the past 4 decades, Charles Murray has been a controversial figure in the US and throughout the English-speaking world. Depending on who you ask, Murray is either one of the most influential, if not the most influential, social scientists of the latter 20th century who continues to publish profoundly thought-provoking books well into the 21st century. Or he's a white, racist, misogynist homophobe who publishes pseudoscience and doesn't even deserve to be heard. No matter what side of the Charles Murray divide you're on, I'm guessing, based on experience, that you probably either don't understand or haven't fleshed out the full implications of his work. Since I can't possibly do justice to all of Murray's ideas in one sitting, we're going to focus on what I think is his most important and consequential of them, which is the idea that the US, and by extension the rest of the planet, is becoming increasingly more polarized according to individual differences in IQ. The idea that society is polarizing in terms of IQ isn't new or recent. 25 years ago, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein warned the people of the US about it in the much maligned, though vastly misunderstood book, The Bell Curve: Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. In fact, the dangerous polarization of humans is the book's central and most important idea, much more important than the superficial issues of race with which the book is associated. In the 25 years since its publication, I've never met a critic of the Bell Curve who's even bothered to read it, much less understand it. To try to get the point across, Murray gave the same basic argument a non-racial makeover in his best-selling 2012 book, Coming Apart: The State of White America, 1960 to 2010. Here's a quick clip of how he describes the polarizing process today.
And so what we have now is we do have an upper class that has inspired a great deal of anger and resentment by ordinary Americans for a very good reason. This new elite despises them, holds them in contempt. And one of the saddest things that's happened in my lifetime is that when I was a boy, it was true that to look down on anyone else because you were smarter or richer than they were was un-American. that's been, as far as I can tell, entirely lost among the elite.
Today, it's no accident that members of a new, multiracial upper class, including people like Michelle and Barack Obama, are moving into multi-million-dollar mansions, while less fortunate whites and blacks are ending up on the streets or dying from drug overdose. This is happening because the educational playing field has been leveled compared to the past, and competition for resources is stiffer. Needless to say, no sane person would ever argue to turn the clock back to the pre-civil rights era. However, it's important to realize that American success at leveling the playing field is also leading to a more stubborn type of inequality that's driven more and more by a person's natural abilities and less by any easily manipulated deficiencies in the environment. Whether we like it or not, the civil rights movement has made society much more efficient at rewarding people with talent and punishing people without it, independent of race, gender, or class. Seen in this light, the incessant calls for social justice in the U.S., which nowadays includes the plight of the poorest whites, literally takes on a different hue. 70 years after the civil rights movement, the changing skin color of America's most disenchanted class is the inevitable outcome of the country's past success at eliminating the barriers to social and economic mobility and allowing the self-interest of the most intellectually gifted people to drive the economy and the culture. Today, even if you're born into absolute poverty in the poorest part of the world, if you happen to be born with lots of intelligence, you're likely to do well, statistically speaking, and you're likely to be recruited by one of the gentlemen on the screen or somebody like them. If, on the other hand, you happen to be born with less intelligence and your parents aren't rich enough to open doors for you, no matter how hard you work, you're probably going to get the short end of the social and economic stick. Based on your intelligence, you might be tempted to say this is not your problem, but it most certainly is. Why? First of all, because this process of social exclusion makes those who are left behind and those who are sympathetic to their plight much more susceptible to populist demagogues and to fascist or Marxist ideology, all of which will eventually come after everything that matters to you. Second, even if you're in the middle or upper class, you're not exempt from the competition or the pressure. You may not be on the streets, but you're living in a polarized society that is overly taxing you on the one hand, or overworking you and keeping you away from your family on the other. The questions that emerge from Herrnstein and Murray's work are piercing. Is a cognitively stratified society the best way to organize ourselves if science is confirming that intellectual capacity isn't equally distributed at birth? What if the incentives are misaligned and the smartest people aren't motivated enough to protect us from global catastrophes? What if we discovered that some smart people want bad things to happen to the rest of us? At what point do we begin to question the idea that intelligence is equal to moral worth? When I was in college, I was introduced to Richard Herrnstein through a student protest in which he was being called every name in the book for his teachings about individual and group differences in intelligence. I signed up for one of his classes intending to debunk his ideas, but it didn't take long for me to realize that he was right. People are not equally intelligent. I was able to extrapolate based on my own experience of being actively recruited into a private high school and then into one of the most prestigious universities in the world with little or no effort on my part. It was clear to me that I had done nothing to deserve what the world was giving me. I understood that if Herrnstein's work on individual differences in intelligence was right, the collective ambition of the country's most talented people would eventually divide and destroy the social fabric of the country, which is more or less exactly what has happened. The most cognitively gifted people of the US, now made up of individuals of every race, have polarized the country, and they've done so by designing and promoting a society that is first and foremost congenial to them. In politics and in the market, the cognitive elite pick a product or an ideology, look for like-minded people with resources, and begin to sell themselves, usually to the detriment of the less able. In fact, it's common for many of the elite to defend the poor and the homeless from within the comfort of their multi-million-dollar mansions. Let's listen again to what Murray has to say about this.
Back in the 1930s, we pretty much took all the limits off what was constitutionally permissible. And in the course of, after doing that, you have had a growth of a variety of the administrative state and regulation and things which basically allow the elite to structure society in ways that are congenial to them.
It's important to stress that none of this is the result of some dark conspiracy by the deep state or by some other nefariously acting secret group. It's actually the result of taking the principles of the Enlightenment seriously and founding a society on them. Today, the US is freer, more just, more equal, and more educated than it has ever been in the past. The increasing polarization is the aggregate effect of billions of daily micro and macro decisions that make a great deal of sense to the ordinary people who make them. After all, who doesn't want to get the best possible job, marry the most talented person, and send their children to the best schools? In this competitive process, being smart pays off, and being dull comes with a price. No single person or group is in charge of this enormous complexity, but leaders in the cognitive elite and the political class that's financed by them logically have the most responsibility. All of this is laid out with unprecedented academic rigor in several of Murray's books, but the most troubling implication of all hasn't been made clear until now with the publication of Human Diversity. I can't possibly do justice to the full depth of the book here, but its most important message is this. In the coming years, we're going to be able to pinpoint with ever greater precision the genetic and biological foundation of human differences. No reputable scholar on either side of the nature versus nurture debate denies the central thesis of human diversity. At most, skeptics can argue that scientists aren't yet able to disentangle the complex interplay between biology and the environment. That's true, but it misses the point. The fact is that some non-negative portion of human differences are genetic in origin, and as science progresses, we're going to be able to identify with ever greater precision the causal underpinnings of these genetic differences. Even if those genetic differences are tiny, which they most certainly are not, it sets into motion all of the forces we've been describing in this video. We don't know of a way to stop these forces because the freer and more equal we become, the faster we polarize. Ultimately, Murray argues that there's nothing to fear from the coming revolution in genomics. According to him, we should simply accept all of the new findings as things that are interesting. I respectfully disagree with Dr. Murray on this. It seems to me that we have a lot to worry about. Why? Because as soon as the genetic underpinnings of things like intelligence and height and skin color are discovered, the most intelligent, ambitious, and entrepreneurial people of the world are going to begin to genetically modify themselves and their children. At first it will be dangerous, but over time the science will become safer. It's highly unlikely that the upper classes will be engineering themselves to be more like the lower classes. In fact, the exact opposite will take place, and the resulting polarization will make our current inequality seem trivial in comparison. This is not science fiction. Do-it-yourself human gene editing is already here, and many people and governments are experimenting with it in labs throughout the world. They will continue to do so, independent of public opinion and independent of whether it's legal or not. What does all of this mean for social policy? Not surprisingly, policy recommendations have been the proverbial Achilles heel for both Murray and Herrnstein. Back in college, when the implications of Herrnstein's work hit me, I immediately understood that the principle of equality on which the US was founded would never work as a foundation for a just society. The fact is that the more just and more equal we make society through things like better education and less corruption, the more we inevitably divide. I asked the professor what could be done about this profound problem, and his response shocked me. He said, "Nobody has the slightest idea." Charles Murray, also, as a card-carrying libertarian, is apt to repeat that he doesn't do solutions. The problem is the apparent dead end into which the science of human genetic diversity leads. According to the Enlightenment, and according to everything we've been taught for the last 300 years, we're all supposed to be equal and infinitely malleable. Who in the world ordered the genetic inequality? When pressed to recommend something, Herrnstein and Murray have made suggestions that are either unacceptable to the lower class, such as saying that people should simply work hard and be happy with their lot in life, or unacceptable to the upper class, such as saying that rich people should live in closer proximity to the poor. As a side note, Murray was one of the pioneer advocates of a universal basic income, and his argument for it is original and persuasive. But if it's successfully implemented, UBI will actually contribute to our polarization. If it's not clear how, we'll talk about it in a future podcast. In characteristic fashion, Murray has dotted human diversity from beginning to end with a series of profound reflections that rival some of the loftiest and most noble sentiments in Western political philosophy, all of which are beautiful and moving and true. I highly recommend the book, or any of his previous books. Unfortunately, none of his very beautiful reflections translate into anything concrete in terms of social policy, and none of them address the core problem of human polarization. So what does all of this bad news have to do with global governance and the management of pandemics? Isn't there any good news? Yes, there is. The problem of human polarization, like the problem of global governance, under which pandemics fall, can only be resolved by effective leadership. Effective leadership, in turn, depends on a correct and full understanding of human nature, which is ultimately rooted in physics. A leadership model that is not rooted in physics is like a house built on sand, which is what the Enlightenment conception of equality and the idea that humans are infinitely malleable is. It's a sandcastle. Humans are not equal, except of course in dignity and human rights, nor are we infinitely malleable. But this is actually a very beautiful and natural thing. As I'll explain in future videos, humans may be born equal in theory, but we certainly don't always die as equals in reality. A Mother Teresa or a Gandhi is not equal to an Adolf Hitler. Understanding the physical and mathematical mechanics of this fundamental human inequality is going to help us balance the errors of the Enlightenment. This more complete understanding of reality will not only help us control our polarization more effectively, it will also help us avoid global catastrophes in the future, and it will foster human flourishing for everybody, without exception. In closing, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to Charles Murray for taking time to sit with me and for the inspirational and courageous legacy of his work. I've placed a link to our full conversation in the video description. If you like what you heard, stick around and let's reason together.